Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. I've been a fan of progressive rock for the last 50 years or so, and there have been many times over the years where people who are being exposed to the genre for the first time have taken me aside and said, "This is really interesting stuff, but where did it all come from? Where did prog rock get its start?" There are people out there who think that the genre started with a big bang in October of 1969 with the release of a single album, King Crimson's debut in the Court of the Crimson King. But it wasn't the start of prog rock per se. There were quite a few things that happened in the 1960s, both artistically and in the music business, that helped prog rock to emerge in the manner that we now know it. In this series, I'm going to go over a bit of that history, and I'll discuss 25 albums that are very significant to the emergence of prog rock. In my opinion, prog rock might have become a very different animal from the one we've come to know and love had these albums not been created over the course of the years 1965 through 1969. Just a quick recap of the criteria that we used to select the albums that comprise the 25 proto-prog albums that shaped prog rock. First off, we selected albums based on their influence. It could be based on the artist's innovation, based on cultural influence, or the use of technology. We restricted ourselves to a single entry per artist on the list in order to promote diversity of the music of the time and to make sure that certain artists that had tremendous commercial appeal at the time didn't dominate the list. Today's entry, the first in our series, comes from the world of jazz. Recorded on December 9th, 1964, at Rudy Van Gelder's legendary studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, for ABC Impulse Records and released in January of 1965. The album is John Coltrane's legendary A Love Supreme. Bob Thiele, the head of ABC Impulse Records, is the credited producer on the album, but this is John Coltrane's project. It is a wonderful record from start to finish. By 1964, when this album was recorded, John Coltrane was already an international star in the world of jazz. He had performed throughout the 1950s with Miles Davis's First Classic Quintet and with Thelonious Monk. By 1960, he had broken off to pursue a solo career, signing first with Atlantic Records, where he made two milestone albums, Giant Steps and My Favorite Things, and then in 1961 moved from Atlantic to Impulse, with one of the largest contracts offered to a jazz artist up until that time. Probably only Miles Davis had a more lucrative contract in the early 1960s in the world of jazz. A Love Supreme is a four-part devotional suite written to honor God. John Coltrane's liner notes for the album are explicit about this in multiple ways, not the least of which is that a detailed prayer is included on the liner notes, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Coltrane had already made several albums for ABC Impulse by the time of August 1964, when he wrote A Love Supreme. The summer of 1964 was a busy time in Coltrane's life. He was doing a lot of touring with his classic quartet, which featured McCoy Tyner on piano, Elvin Jones on drums, and Jimmy Garrison on upright bass. John Coltrane's first son, John Jr., was born in August of '64, and John and his wife, his second wife, Alice, took the time to relax and basically take some time away from the band, time away from the road, and to enjoy their new baby. Before too long, however, Coltrane was hard at work composing. He spent apparently about 4 or 5 days away from the rest of the family at their home in Dix Hills, Long Island, writing what would become A Love Supreme. When he emerged, Train told Alice that he had basically been gifted the work by God, that for the first time in his career, he had everything exactly mapped out for what he wanted to do with a new album. In addition to the birth of Coltrane's son, there was another significant event in Coltrane's life that inspired the composition of A Love Supreme. Throughout the 1950s, John Coltrane suffered from a rather debilitating heroin habit. Miles Davis had fired him from his band at one point, ultimately allowing him to return in 1957 after Coltrane was able to kick his habit. Coltrane mentions in the liner notes of A Love Supreme that 1957 was the year in which he experienced a spiritual awakening, and that is one of the things that is being celebrated in A Love Supreme, the composition. Part of A Love Supreme, the first part of the 4-part suite, Acknowledgement, was tested on the road before the quartet went into Rudy Van Gelder's studio in December. The rest of it was new to the band at the time, although Coltrane did brief them on what he wanted to do with various parts of the suite. Clearly, some of the suite would be improvised in the studio, but there were some specific themes that Coltrane wanted to include. The recording came together very quickly. The first portion of the suite, Acknowledgement, was recorded in a single take, including the chanting section at the end of the track, where you can hear Coltrane's voice on record repeating some 19 times the phrase "A Love Supreme," using the upright bass leitmotif that is presented in this part of the suite. The second section of the suite, Resolution, is a showcase for pianist McCoy Tyner. The third portion of the suite, Pursuance, features 2 lengthy drum solos by Elvin Jones and a fairly lengthy bass improvisation by Jimmy Garrison, which leads into Psalm, the 4th and final portion of the suite. The Psalm movement of A Love Supreme is particularly interesting. Coltrane's biographer, Lewis Porter from Rutgers University, has referred to Psalm as a wordless recitation. Psalm's structure ties back to the prayer that is provided by Coltrane in the liner notes of the album. What Coltrane does with Psalm is set the prayer to music, but without lyrics. The solo he's playing follows the structure and the syllables and breaks of his words and sentences in the prayer. It's a beautiful achievement and a fairly inspirational one for those who recognize how the piece is constructed. So, why is A Love Supreme important to progressive rock? Well, it's important both musically and spiritually. From a musical perspective, A Love Supreme incorporates many facets that would inspire first psychedelic music and then subsequently progressive rock music. It is very Eastern flavored. Coltrane was an avid listener of Indian music. He ultimately developed a very close friendship with Ravi Shankar in the last years of his life, and put together some wonderful pieces of music, not only on this album, but on his earlier Impulse albums going back to 1962, 1963. Some of the musicians that were inspired by Coltrane's music are very well known. Roger McGuinn of the Byrds in particular was very much making a nod to Coltrane in the composition of his solos for, the Byrds song 8 Miles High in particular. And there are other songs in the Byrds and in McGuinn's repertoire that return to this raga style of playing, as it's been called. Moving a few years later, as jazz rock and jazz fusion began taking hold as both a musical and as a more commercial force, Carlos Santana and John McLaughlin would both be heavily influenced by Coltrane, so much so that the two of them in 1973 would ultimately join forces to release an album called Love, Devotion, Surrender, which was very much inspired by their love of Coltrane's music and features cover versions of two of Coltrane's more famous songs, including the acknowledgement section from A Love Supreme. From a lyrical and spiritual perspective, the words of Coltrane's poem for Psalm are very much in line with some of what you would see by some of the leading progressive rock lyricists in the early and middle 1970s. I, in particular, can't picture that John Anderson would have written Close to the Edge the same way had he not been aware of Coltrane's music. Close to the Edge, of course, had other inspirations, including Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha. Anderson was very well read and very well listened and incorporated many, many themes and influences into Hesse's music. This is just one example, obviously, but this album has touched a lot of people, and deservedly so. It is a wonderful piece of music. I would recommend that if you haven't heard it, definitely look it up and you'll understand why it has been popular and so heavily revered for over 50 years. If you're interested in finding out more about how A Love Supreme was written and recorded, there is a wonderful book by the author Ashley Kahn on the making of A Love Supreme that was released in the year 2002. It's terrific reading with interviews Kahn conducted with the surviving participants from the recording at the time that the book was written in the early 2000s. Heavily recommended. Well, there you have it. We'll be back soon to discuss the next artist on the list. In the meantime, if you have any thoughts or questions about this particular show, please feel free to share them in the comments. And please feel free to subscribe and keep track of upcoming shows as we go forward. Thanks very much. Take care.